Всем привет.
Hi everyone.
Я очень люблю Питер, на самом деле.
I love
Причин
St.
несколько.
Petersburg
Первая
for
причина —
several
это всегда
reasons.
можно
First
найти
of all,
крутой
you can
пивко.
always find cool beer here.
Вторая причина — это очень
The
крутая
second reason
community,
is the
которая мне
awesome
очень нравится,
community,
и
which I
прям
really
очень
like,
здорово, что
and
вы
it's
сюда
great
пришли,
that
меня
you're all
позвали.
here today. I'm
Я
very
сегодня
happy to be
приехал.
here too.
Меня зовут Антон.
My name is
Там
Anton.
какие-то
You
контакты
can
можно
find my
посмотреть,
contact
и вам надо
information
про
on
меня
the
знать ровно
screen.
3 вещи.
And there are three
Здесь
things you
первое,
need
я
to know
люблю
about me.
стикеры.
Number
К
one,
сожалению,
I
на
love
ноутбуке их нету
stickers.
пока,
Unfortunately,
но
there
скоро
are
они
none
будут.
on my new
У меня
laptop,
есть
but I'm
стикеры
gonna
с
put
Hanami,
them
так что если
soon.
кто-то хочет
I have
стикеры
some Hanami
какие-то, то,
stickers, so if you
пожалуйста,
like, we
давайте
can trade
поменяемся.
some.
Второе, я люблю open
The
source.
second thing is I love open
Наверное,
source.
всё.
Nothing to add
И
here.
третье, я очень
And
ленивый
thirdly,
человек, поэтому этот
I'm
доклад можно найти
quite
по вот этой ссылке.
quite a lazy person, so you can find this presentation by this link.
Сегодня мы поговорим про
Today we're going to
архитектуру.
talk about
Я
architecture.
нашел такую фотографию,
I
сделал
found
красивую
this pretty
надпись, но, к
picture and
сожалению, мы
added
будем
a pretty
говорить немножко
caption,
другую
but
архитектуру.
we'll be
Я не могу
talking about a
назваться
different
архитектором,
architecture.
но
I
какие-то
can't call
решения я
myself an
принимаю,
architect, but I
и зачем
do
вообще этот доклад
make
нужен
certain
сегодня.
decisions
Он
why this
нужен
talk
по
might be
нескольким
useful.
причинам.
There are
Кстати, я
several
быстро
reasons.
предупрежу, у меня всего
By the way, I have
50%,
to
потому
warn
что
you,
я
I
сегодня
only
был в
have
Сапсане
50%
работал,
of my
поэтому если у меня
battery
экран
since I
погаснет,
worked on the
простите.
train on the way here, so I'm sorry if the
Зачем
screen
доклад
turns off.
нужен?
Why am I
Во-первых, я
giving
хочу
this
хоть
talk?
как-то
Firstly, I want
унифицировать
to
все свои идеи
unify
в
the
голове
ideas in my head
и как-то
and create
унифицировать и сделать
a
какой-то гайд для
guideline
того,
on
чтобы
writing in
писать на
Hanami.
Hanami. Вторая причина, я
The
хочу
second
фидбэк
reason is
получить,
that I'm looking
потому
for
что фидбэк
feedback.
это очень важно,
Feedback
очень
is
здорово.
important.
Все
We
мы
all
любим
love
фидбэк, потому
feedback,
что он
be it
любой,
positive or
положительный,
negative.
негативный, это
It's
не важно.
great to
Главное,
have it
чтобы он был.
anyway.
И
And
вообще,
I
на
won't
самом
be
деле, мой
talking
сегодняшний
about
доклад будет не про
architecture,
архитектуру,
but
ни разу,
about
а про
problems.
проблемы. Мы все живем
We
в
live in
мире,
a
в
real
реальном, у нас
world
нету чистых
where there are
функций.
no
Если мы
clean
будем открывать
functions. If
1000
we
раз
open
дверь
and close a
туда-сюда,
door
она
for 1,000
сломается.
times, it will
Никаких
break
монад и
eventually.
функторов, к
There are no
сожалению.
monads or
И проблем у нас
functors.
реально очень много, особенно в
And there are
нашей
a lot of
работе. Это
problems in
могут
what we
быть
do,
какие-то менеджментские
management
проблемы, это могут
problems,
быть
performance
перформанс-проблемы.
problems,
И, наверное,
and
самые
probably the most
популярные и самые
frequent
частые
ones,
это проблемы, связанные с
maintenance
поддержкой.
issues.
И сегодня как раз мы об этом и будем
And that's
говорить.
what I'm going to talk about today.
Если
If you try to
попробовать
Google
загуглить
something
что-то,
related to project
связанное с
maintenance,
поддержкой проектов, то
Google
влево вы
Google
увидите
comes
вот
up
такие
with
вот
such beautiful
замечательные
phrases.
фразы. И на самом деле
In fact,
пол или год
half a
назад
year
я
ago
начал
or so,
увлекаться
I took
Ильяховым.
interest in
Я не
Ilyahov.
знаю, кто не знает, кто
Does
такой
anyone know
Ильяхов.
who Ilyahov is? Right in the bridge.
Молодец.
Right you are.
Я начал увлекаться Ильяховым.
Ilyahov is
Он
engaged with
занимается
news writing
инфостилем,
and solving
он нужен для того,
stylistic
чтобы
issues
писать
for
хорошо, и
smooth
чтобы вас
writing, which
понимали.
makes the
У него
reader
есть главред,
understand what you are
и
saying.
главред
He
такая
launched
штука,
the
ты
GloveRed
текст
project.
скармливаешь
You
ему
feed
туда,
a
он
text
такой
to
говорит, вот эта
GloveRed,
фигня,
and
вот
it
эта фигня,
highlights
и
all
если
the
вы
rubbish in
написать
your
хороший
text.
код,
If you
вы
print
увидите вот такую
good code,
ошибку,
it shows an
негативная
error.
оценка, потому
Biased
что что значит
evaluation.
чистый код?
What
Вот
does
кто-то
clean
здесь
code
может мне
really
привести
mean? Can
пример
anyone
чистого
give
кода
me
и
an example
нечистого
of a
кода?
clean code and not a clean
Ну
code?
вот, именно
That's
так.
it.
Поэтому чего мы на
So,
самом-то деле
what do
хотим?
we really
Мы
want?
хотим добавлять
We
фичи.
want to add new
Что для этого
features.
нам надо? Нам нужна
What do we need for
изоляция,
that?
нам
We
нужна
need
какая-то последовательность
isolation,
логики, чтобы мы не путались в
sequential
том, что
logic for
происходит.
us not to lose
И
track of
нам не очень
what's
нужен
going
глобальный
on.
стейт, потому
And
что
we don't
глобальный
really need
стейт
global
создает
state
некоторые
because it
проблемы. Например,
entails
самая
certain
простая проблема.
problems. For
Кто любит
instance,
смокать
who
тесты,
likes
которые
mocking
асинхронно
tests performed
выполняются, и один мок
asynchronously when
перекрывает
one
другой
mock
мок, в итоге
overlaps
у вас два
another
теста,
and you
которые
get two
непонятно как
tests which
работают в
work
этой
in an
итерации, но в
unclear
следующей
manner
они
in
работают,
this
потому что моки
iteration, but they
сработали
work fine
правильно.
in the next
Вот
iteration
как-то
because
так.
the mocks worked correctly.
Поэтому global state,
That's why
он
global
чаще мешает, чем
state
помогает,
happens to
но зато
hinder more
программы с
often
global
than
state
help.
проще писать
However, for
мейнтейнерам.
maintainers, global state
И
programs are
также мы
easier to
хотим
write.
удалять или рефакторить
We
старый
also
код,
want
потому
to
что фичи
delete
не
or
нужны, их
refactor
надо
old
как-то
code
удалять,
because
менеджеры
features become
горят, кодовая
unnecessary
база
and they
растет.
need
И
to
для
be
этого нам тоже
removed
нужна изоляция,
somehow.
потому что
Managers
при
are on
изоляции мы
fire,
можем просто
code
взять
base keeps
отпочковать и
growing.
удалить,
That's why we need
и нам нужно
isolation
покрытие
because it
тестами,
allows us to branch
поэтому,
things
как
out and
видно,
remove
вот
them.
этот Пепе,
And we
он
also
хочет
need test
как-то подвести
coverage.
итоги,
And
и
Pepe
всего-то
here
нам
wants
надо
to conclude that
изолировать
what we
последовательно все
need is
выполнить без глобального
isolation,
стейта, и
execute
покрыть
everything
тестами, тогда наша
sequentially
жизнь
with no
будет
global
прекрасна и
state, and
радостна.
ensure test
Но
coverage.
мы
Then
живем в
everything will be
реальном мире,
nice
а в
and
реальном
easy.
мире у нас есть
But in the
такие
real
экшены,
world,
это
we have
реальный
such
продакшн
actions.
код.
Here's an example of
Если
a
кому-то
real
интересно,
production
я могу
code.
скинуть
If you're
гист.
curious, I can send you a gist.
Я не шучу, это реально продакшн.
No kidding. It's real production code.
Не, вниз не мотается.
No, you can't scroll it. I did it this way on purpose. How can we improve the situation to avoid all this trash? It's abstractions, of course. We all love abstractions. Raise your hand if you love abstractions. And I've drawn this pyramid for you, spent several hours drawing it, and we'll be climbing up this pyramid and filling it with abstractions. And we shall start with actions, because actions are awesome. We love MVC pattern. It tells us how to draw an owl in 2 goes. First, you do view and controllers, and then you make the model. What solutions to our problems do we have? What comes to mind first are functional or callable objects. Anything can be such an object. A service, a handwritten service, other kinds of services, interactors, dry transactions, operations, trailblazer operations, whatever. You can learn more on my channel, so I'm just scratching the surface right now. Why do we even need this? This object takes certain values, does something inside, and brings back the result. And the result contains a state. It can be a hash with a key, an interactor, which returns a state. It can be an either monade, which you put into the matcher and it all breaks and then miraculously works again. And it all brings you isolation, which is very useful because when there is such an action, you can see a thing which calls something, returns a result, and then you work with this result, and that's basically all that you need. You don't have to think about how it's going on. You need to obtain a result and do something with it. That's an example of a logical sequence, an actual code. I had to blur over a lot of stuff there, but this is a piece of code from my working app. We use this kind of handwritten operations. It contains steps. It's dry transaction. I don't know whether you are familiar with dry transaction. Wow. Then slides about dry are coming up special for you. There are several steps. They are sequential. There is a validator. If you don't want to use the dry transaction, there is no reason why you can't put the method calls one after another, which will or will not raise something. What makes these objects great is that they don't add any global state, because every time you create a new object, or even you don't, but I'll get back to it later, it appears that if you have written a proper callable object which doesn't develop any state inside, no matter how many times you call this function, it's still gonna be clean and gonna return the same value, if it doesn't ping the database or something else. These things are very easy to test, especially with actions in Hanami. For instance, we can use dependency injection, which I really love. It's the most correct way of using dependency injection in Ruby. And then you just transfer an object which returns whether the result is success or unsuccess. You don't have to create loads of logic. A simple question: who has created 5 factories today at work to run a test, and it worked? I'm not alone, and it's good enough. You just forward an object, and it doesn't matter what the object does. What matters is that it returns a result you further work with, and you process this result in the action. Besides, if you don't want to get fancy, you can perfectly forward an ordinary lambda, which won't do anything particular, but such objects, when implemented correctly, would call other objects, and it leads to confusion. A widespread approach is when you open the services folder and it loads for 2 seconds because it contains almost 2,000 files. In this case, it's preferable to isolate such objects to public and private. Public objects can be called from wherever, while private objects can be called only from the public ones or other private objects. And it has its issues, quite a few actually. First of all, there are many objects that you have to manage. Much more than a huge method in a model of 200 lines. Long names for objects. This name I found in one of my working projects while on the train. It's like 5th nesting level. Fun. And these objects I've given the example of have to be continuously created. There might be certain performance issues, and you have to create an object for every call with some dependencies. These dependencies might have to be forwarded all the time, and that's quite a problem, which can be solved with the help of containers. If you thought of Docker, it's not it, even though it could be fun. It's the next abstraction, invention of control containers, which help us a lot, and there's much information about them on my channel as well. And I'm going to talk about the dry container because I really like it. And I know that it's a very popular thing to talk about, so it's something you'll have to endure, sorry. It goes as follows. You create an object, register another object into it, and then you take this object and do something with it. In practice, it is as simple as it sounds. Looks like that. And in fact, it looks horrible because almost nothing changed here, but on the other hand, you don't have to create a new interactor instance for every action call. You just take a predefined instance and work with it. And of course, there are pros. You control global state because it's finally in one place and something can be done with it. You can memorize the instances and you don't have to create everything anew every time. Easy to mock for testing because you just mock the controller and it all perfectly works. And advanced level, you can resolve dependencies in the startup of your application. If you lack any dependencies, you won't be able to run your app. And it often saves the day. You can learn more about it on my channel, but we can use it much better, and we need dry for that. Dry auto-inject is a thing I'm trying to sell you again. Why can it be useful? It adds steroids to our dependency injection from the container, and that's how you use it. You create an object and assign it to an import constant. Next, you forward this constant and include the required item from the container. Magically, it creates dependency injection, after which you just use the getter, create user, and call it. Apart from that, this magical line does the following. It adds a parameter to your constructor, which allows to forward your own dependency, which is also very helpful in terms of testing, as I've demonstrated earlier. And our next abstraction filler is models. I've said that models are fun. We all love writing models. Nobody tells us how to make them, but they are everywhere. What can we do here to improve our life? Let's take our callable objects and put all the logic into them, which is why there will be no logic in our models. If we stop validating in models and start validating on the transport level, we'll get rid of huge meta schemes, which contain a lot of condition validation, which break, and when you try to save some data, validation doesn't work, and that makes you cry. A simple option is to use outside validation. The model should only obtain and save data. That's all that it should do. What could help us here are query objects. We've talked about months ago. I am lazy. In most cases, these are repositories. Repositories are profoundly described in Hanami guides. Apart from that, frightful as it may seem, there are good guides by Microsoft. They are mostly for .NET, but they contain a lot of interesting stuff. Besides query objects, change sets may be used, sending regards to Phoenix, ROM, or comment patterns, which I'm referring to this way for no reason, since it's not a comment pattern. It's required to eliminate all the callbacks and to make logic sequential. And for instance, it may look this way. You do the class, which takes the repository and creates something by adding a date for created add. Or you can use ROM, then you create a change set class, which will merge the current day into the data. It's in the third line. And next, using this change set and forwarding some data, you will receive an updated value for your tables with a defined date. And our well keeps filling. We are moving from models to application level. I had an awesome experience. I came to work once. There was a Rails application with a model. In 2 weeks, it turned out that we had another Rails application, and they happened to have a common model. So to add something into one application, we had to do migration in the other, run them, and then deploy. In 2 weeks, another Rails app appeared, and it had a common model as well. I don't know what happened next because I left. But if we look at Hanami, we'll see that there's an application which has apps, and there is a library where data is shared between these apps. And it's mind-blowing. As you remember, we had certain actions, some transport, which called public objects, which called private objects. Instead, we can use applications which will call everything just this way. As a result, we can get tons of various applications, and all of them will apply the same business logic, and you won't have to share it between the applications, copy it whatsoever. One repository on GitHub or GitLab will be enough for you, and you'll be working with it, and it's going to be great. It also allows to run one application at a time. That's how you can balance your system in a more flexible way. For example, you have admin section, which starts failing, rather an API, which does. So instead of multiplying 20 instances, you can deploy 10 instances of API and 3 instances of admin, and it will be fine. And problems, of course, we can't skip that. We are talking about problems today. First of all, and we use this approach at work, I'll come back to it later, it happens that our developers update one application but forget about the other. So one application works while the other falls apart. But we are working on it. We've improved the review process. Sometimes you need to call not the same logic from 2 actions, but another very similar logic, but it's still different. So in such cases, it's better to do it twice and use 2 different objects instead of one meta object. And we need to go deeper into our upside-down abstraction as well. And I really have to warn you, what I've just talked about is going to help you right now. But what I'm going to talk about further, not necessarily. It's an advanced level, and to figure it out properly requires time and effort, and I unfortunately don't have that. And we'll start with domains. DDD. Who's heard about it? And who's using it? Wow. Good for you guys. In fact, there is a great book. When I read it for the first time, I looked like this. How can we use it? We can take a minor idea. It turns out that our application consists of domains, and we may try to isolate these domains in our application so that they would communicate with each other through some public interface, and your logic won't get mixed in the app. Everything will be on its place. There are 2 advantages here. Number one, it will be easy for you to create a separate service, because everyone loves microservices. It's very trendy now. And number 2, if you have containers, for instance, a dry container, it works so well with domains. You only have to connect the required part of the container to your app and not to launch the whole thing at the startup. There are some disadvantages, however, hard to start and too many files. For some reason, web developers don't like it when you have to write 3 files instead of 1. That's why they usually write 1 file with 1,000 lines rather than 3 files with 100 lines each. I don't know why, but it may lead to such a scary picture. You have some applications, you have domains, which communicate with a core library that contains repositories and entities whatsoever. However, HTTP is a minor share of our system. Who doesn't use background processing in production? Background processing is another kind of transport because you call something and it calls your business logic. That means you are using at least two transport levels. And if we are talking about Hanami in this picture, HTTP applications are quite redundant because there is this one big transport level. There can be all kinds of things, websockets, rack, which I've misspelled here, background processing, ETL, anything. They all use business logic, I've marked with red over here. It appears that this whole system consists of transport and business logic. To make it all work, one part creates events callable by the other part. For instance, you may have user-created, post-created, payment added, order completed, and so on. And spilling abstractions out of our well comes event sourcing. To understand what it is, you can visit a very good website, microservice architecture. It's very cool. You have a huge event log. Looks like that. You have an application, a user knocks on. Instead of saving it into the database, it saves the event into the event log. It doesn't save the current state, it saves the changes that would lead to a result. And this huge event log can work with a variety of things. It could be Elixir apps, Crystal apps, or any other apps in any other language. What's important is that you preserve the business logic and extra persistence level is added, because you have your app which creates an event, the event is saved in the log. Any business logic required to process something can read all the necessary data from the log, process it and forward it somewhere if required. But this approach has one major drawback. Since you are using the event log, to get the current state, you need to calculate all the log. Just as you do in Git, you calculate the state for the present moment, and that'll be your current state. But you can calculate the state for the previous day or the day before. As a solution, clever guys have devised CQRS. There's a Fowler's quote over here. You have something that produces an event, saves it in the event log, and something that takes the event from the log. And you need to somehow save the current state. It can be saved in different ways, in SQL, in Elastic, or say Mongo if you are using it. To do it, the green square, which takes the event from the log with a minor change, can update another database for reading. And you're going to have two storages as a result, one for reading, one for writing. Because the red square, which works with the user, goes to a cached storage, say SQL, to add the number of users or something else. And as for Hanami, it's easy to use one application and run your server without an application at all. The approach has several advantages. You can read them on the screen. It's a very persistent thing. You can always roll back to any day. If Postgres fails, how it has happened recently, you always have a chance to build up your current state with the help of the event log, or the state at any given moment. It has its drawbacks too. The major one is a completely different approach towards architecture, which is why you'll have to think differently. Instead of saving data right into the database, you'll have to first validate your data, then save it in the event log, and only then take it from the event log and save into the database. So it's a complication here. How to start using it? Recently, guys have released Kafka version 1.1. It's a thing over Kafka for Rails. It has its issues. 2 months ago, the code wasn't that good, but it works. Then there is a Polish project. They have a book, really worth reading, though you would want something more hardcore, maybe. At Hanami, we make Hanami events, proof of concept, just transport layer with some events. You can create events using any adapters, or you may write your own if you are interested. In fact, everything I've just covered, all these 163 slides, are not only about Rails and Hanami. For instance, working with Hippo, we use dry ROM. We don't use Hanami and Rails, but we apply event sourcing and all the ideas I've just covered. That's why it's not only applicable to a particular framework, you can use it with anything else. And to conclude, if you want to bring out something from what I've talked about for 25 minutes, please remember 3 points. First, isolate it. It's better to isolate, and even isolate more than necessary, than not to isolate and get it all messed up. There were quite a few keywords and buzzwords. There is no point in using all that in production or in your projects right away. Take your time to look into it, read about it, and decide whether you really need it or not. And the last but not least, maintenance is important, so let's do it in a more simple way. You can find some ideas by this link. Much information and links and what I've talked about you can find here and on my channel. That's basically it. Thank you for your attention. I even made it in less than 30 minutes.